My name is Terrell Jermaine, Starr, senior reporter with The Root, and I am here with 2020 Democratic Presidential Candidate Beto O'Rourke. How you doing?
I'm good. Thanks for having me on. Appreciate it.
Clean hands.
Yeah, that's right. Just washed them.
Okay, so a lot of voters' biggest concerns this election season is beating Donald Trump. So tell us how you're going to do that.
I think it's going to require a movement. It's not going to be any one person. I don't even think it can be just the Democratic Party. We're going to have to find a way to bring people in who have been locked out of their democracy, folks who've given up. We were talking earlier about states like Georgia and Texas. There's a reason that Texas before 2018 ranked 50th in voter turnout in the country. We were literally drawn that way. Folks drawn out of a congressional district because of the color of their skin or their ethnicity. People who can use their license to carry a firearm to prove who they are at the ballot box, but can't use their student ID at Paul Quinn College to prove who they are at the ballot box. In our campaign in Texas last year, we went to every one of the 254 counties, showed up with the same bold, progressive message, but were able to win not just an expanded Democratic Party electorate. We won independents for the first time in decades. 500,000 Republicans voted for a Republican for governor and voted for us on the same ballot. And I was a candidate who was talking about healthcare, but healthcare that also means reproductive rights in a state that's suffering a maternal mortality crisis that is 3 times as deadly for women of color. So I think we can run a campaign that's bold, it's progressive, but it is inclusive and ensures that this democracy works for everyone. That's how you beat Donald Trump in 2020. That's how you bring the country together again in 2021.
Now, some critics say you don't stand a chance because you lost to Ted Cruz.
To those critics, I would say we won more votes than any Democrat has in the history of the state of Texas. We were 50th in voter turnout before the 2018 election. We are no longer. We saw young voter turnout up nearly 500% in early voting. We had Texas turnout at near presidential election levels in a midterm election. And though I didn't win, we have 2 new members of Congress, both Democrats, who took the seats of Republicans, helping to flip the House of Representatives. 17 African American women who just won election to judicial positions in Harris County, literally changing the face of criminal justice. That's the result of a movement when we bring everybody in and ensure that those barriers that we have in our democracy are transcended. That's the way that I'm running for president. And again, I think that's the way that we build the movement that defeats Donald Trump in 2020.
Now, you received backlash when you said you were born to run for president. And given that this is the most diverse field of Democratic candidates ever, some voters, frankly, don't think we need another white man in the White House. Yeah. So why should black voters vote for you?
No one's born to be president. Anyone who wants to serve in that office of trust has to earn the trust of the people of this country. And the only way to do that is to show up the way that we're showing up everywhere for everyone, writing nobody off, taking nobody for granted. So the issues that are most important to the people of this country are the issues that are most important to me. We don't take any money from PACs, from special interests, from corporations, from lobbyists. It's all people all the time. Their issues will be front and center, not just in this campaign, but during our administration. So beyond the fact that we have the most diverse, the most exceptional field of contenders in the history of the Democratic Party, in the history of the United States of America, what we've got to be focused on is that candidate who can bring the greatest number of people to the ballot box, that candidate who can lead a movement that ensures that we fulfill these incredibly ambitious priorities that we have for this country, whether they're economic, healthcare, climate, criminal justice, or otherwise. It's going to take a movement of people to get this done.
You're currently polling at 2% among likely Iowa caucus voters, according to a recent poll. So it's predicted that Joe Biden will clinch the nomination. So what makes you more qualified?
You know, it's rare that a poll in June, the year before a presidential election, ever accurately foretells who our next nominee is going to be. Furthermore, I've never allowed a poll to ever determine the decisions that I've made, the positions that I've chosen, the things that I say, those challenges that I choose to face. If I relied on polls, I never would have run for the United States House of Representatives, never would have beat the odds and the incumbent. If I relied on polls, I never would have taken on Ted Cruz. No Democrat in Texas was willing to take on Ted Cruz. But we knew that we were at a defining moment of truth, and it was important that somebody stand up and travel those 254 counties and do so on a boldly progressive agenda. So I'm confident that in the months between now and that first caucus in Iowa, that first primary in New Hampshire, we'll have the opportunity to meet and listen to those voters, those caucus goers, who will decide this election. And lastly, I've got the most exceptional team of volunteers and supporters, folks who are working their hearts out, knocking on doors, making phone calls, hosting canvases out of their homes. I think that's the way that you do it. It's grassroots, it's people power, and that's what's powering this campaign.
The Central Park Five, who now refer to themselves as the Exonerated Five, are back in the spotlight after Ava DuVernay's series release. Do you think Donald Trump should apologize to these men?
He should. He should apologize to the Central Park Five. He should apologize to President Barack Obama for challenging the country of his birth, stoking racism in this country. He should apologize to the immigrants that he's called rapists and criminals, though they commit crimes at a far lower rate than those here in this country. He should apologize to the United States for describing Klansmen and neo-Nazis and white supremacists and terrorists as very fine people. This is the most divisive, the most xenophobic, the most racist, the most nativist, the most Islamophobic president we have ever had. And it's not just that he offends our sensibilities, it's that his conduct and his actions lead to practices and policies that will forever change this country. You don't get a rise in hate crimes each one of the last 3 years without a president who invites this as well as condones it. You don't get kids in cages until you've dehumanized them by describing them as animals or an infestation. You don't see this rise in attacks on Muslim Americans until you have promised to ban all Muslim travel to the United States of America. So we've got to stand up against him specifically and call this out, but we also have to stand for what we believe. We don't just respect, we don't just tolerate our differences, we embrace them as the very source of our strength and success.
The case of the Exonerated Five also shed light on issues at every level of the criminal justice system, many of which have not been improved. And we know that black people are overly represented in the criminal justice system. What's your plan to fix it?
Let's end a war on drugs that has become a war on people. Let's end the prohibition on marijuana, expunge the arrest records for those caught in possession of a substance that is legal in more than half the states of the union. Let's acknowledge that Americans of all races and ethnicities use marijuana, use illegal drugs at the same rate, but only some are stopped and frisked and arrested. Only some upon release will have to check a box on every employment application form, will no longer qualify for student loans to be able to advance their prospects and those of this country. And let's recognize that our criminal justice system is part of a foundational racism that began at the very inception of this country. Kidnapping people from West Africa, transporting them here in bondage, building the wealth of America through the work of slaves whose descendants have in no meaningful way been able to share in the fruits of their labors. It's not just criminal justice, as important as that is. It's healthcare, where you see gross disparity in access and outcomes. It's in education. It's in access to this economy, where you see 10 times the wealth in white America than you do in black America. So yes, let's institute these criminal justice reforms to include the end of any for-profit prisons, the end of the cash bail system, an increase in funds to public defenders, but let's go well beyond that.
When you were running for Senate, you laid out a plan in an op-ed, your vision for criminal justice reform in Texas, including an end to for-profit jails. As president, what is your plan to end the for-profit jail system?
We should never allow someone to make a profit incarcerating another human being, whether that's in our traditional criminal justice system or whether it's in our immigration detention system. You literally have companies who make enough money to send lobbyists to Capitol Hill to be able to persuade lawmakers through their political action committee donations to set mandatory minimums, to keep marijuana as a Schedule I drug, to continue this war on people that has produced the largest prison population on the planet, one disproportionately comprised of people of color. So you will not get out of this pattern. You will not discontinue visiting this injustice unless you end the profit incentive to do that.
How do we do that, though? I mean, like, how specifically, strategically would you plan on doing that?
So every lever of executive authority will be used in my administration to stop for-profit prisons. I'll work with colleagues in Congress to bar this by statute from happening going forward. But then I think we got to add to that by ensuring that we look at the entire criminal justice system. So end a cash bail system that keeps some people locked up based on a function of their income or their wealth or their luck. Make sure that we look at sentencing reform and the expungement of records for folks who've been arrested for nonviolent drug crimes. We want to make sure that they're able to fully participate in economic life, and importantly, making sure that they can participate in democratic life. I want to make sure that 4 million of our fellow Americans who have a criminal justice record can fully participate in choosing who their representatives are going to be or running for office if that's what they choose to do.
Okay, so in 2017, you voted for the Thin Blue Line Act, which is known as the Blue Lives Matter bill. You've since expressed regret for that vote. We're curious as to what was your thinking behind supporting that bill.
Yeah. It's a vote that I regret. I wanted to ensure that any attack on a police officer who have among the toughest jobs that we can think of is a factor in a person's sentencing. But I don't believe in the death penalty. I don't believe that our government should be taking anyone's life, so it should not be a factor towards the imposition of a death sentence. And so for that reason, it was a mistake to make that vote, and it's one that I regret.
Okay, and I think also people are also thinking that police officers who do die on the job, the killers are often convicted if they're caught, and whereas in the case of people who are shot and killed by police, particularly unjustifiably, don't get that justice. And I think that was one of the reasons why people were upset with that line of thinking.
Yeah, I'd really want them to know that I've been outspoken about the unjustified killing of unarmed black men, children in this country. Talking about Black Lives Matter in a long tradition of civil rights leadership, going head to head with the chief of police in El Paso, Texas over this very issue. Answering a question during the Senate campaign in Texas about whether it dishonors the service of veterans and members of the United States military when NFL players take a knee, and saying, no, this is part of service to country, making sure that this democracy really works and reflects the sacrifices of everyone, and that we call attention to injustice wherever it is in this country. So not only will I continue to speak out on this issue, as president, I will do everything in my power to hold law enforcement accountable for crimes that they commit, to use the Department of Justice and the full weight of the federal government when a local DA or state government is incapable or unwilling of pursuing justice, and tying federal funds to full transparency, disclosure of use of force, and making sure that there are real consequences, and also training for police officers and sheriff's deputies to make sure that no one fears those who've been sworn to serve and protect everybody.
You have called for full accountability and justice for Sandra Bland after video footage of her arrest was released. As president, how do you plan on seeking justice for Sandra Bland?
In her case, I want to make sure that those who are responsible for her death, for pulling her over for really nothing, perhaps because she was a black woman, who humiliated her, who put her in a position from which she never recovered, that they're held accountable. That we use this as an example to teach law enforcement throughout this country about the sanctity of every human life in this country and the respect and dignity with which our fellow Americans are born, in which they should be treated in every encounter with law enforcement or any other part of American life. And that goes for law enforcement who are responsible for taking the lives of others all across this country far too often without any real repercussions or accountability or justice. Unless you have justice, I guarantee you this will continue to happen year after year in this country. And so there must be that accountability, or you will not see an end to this practice in America.
Your opponent, Julian Castro, is in favor of making police officers more accountable to the public by limiting qualified immunity. Police officers, they could actually be sued civilly and criminally with limited qualified immunity. Would you be in favor of supporting that?
Of course. Justice is justice. And if a member of law enforcement abuses the power and public trust that we've placed in them, they should face the consequences. There's nothing that should exempt them. And in fact, I think this is the will of Congress going back to the 19th century. I believe this idea of sovereign immunity has been misinterpreted by the Supreme Court. I think it's a responsibility of the next administration to clarify that, work with members of Congress, and ensure that we're appointing people to federal benches, and including the Supreme Court, who respect the full civil rights of every single American and do not allow anyone, including those who wear a badge, to exempt themselves from justice in this country. So yes, let's hold everybody to account.
So to be clear, you say you would support your opponent Julian Castro's plan of limited qualified immunity for police officers?
Yes, I think any American should be able to sue and bring to justice a member of law enforcement if they have abused their power and the public trust that we've placed in them.
You supported Colin Kaepernick's protest against police brutality.
I fully support what Colin Kaepernick did and what other athletes are doing right now. They're using this position that they're in that commands so much attention to direct that to institutional racism and injustice in this country, knowing full well that if we don't look at this, if we don't understand the full American story, we're never going to fix it. It's never going to get better. They're in a long tradition of civil rights champions, and I fully support what they're doing.
When asked about reparations, you've talked about reforming numerous systems as a start to repairing America's wrongs to black people. Do you support cash reparations for descendants of American slaves?
I think ultimately we may arrive at that conclusion. But before we do, I think every single American needs to know the full story of this country. And right now we don't.
Yes, that's a good point. I think the point of cash reparations, I think there are many people who are familiar. I think particularly for black people, and since you know the history and the story of America, would you directly support cash reparations since you know the story?
I would support those steps that would allow us to repair the damage done and to stop visiting this kind of injustice on future generations. But I'm convinced that in a democracy, unless everybody understands the story of this country, and most people do not, you'll never get to that action or that end result.
There will be a lot of people, pardon me to interject, there'll be a lot of people who would say that a lot of Americans did not understand why Jim Crow was wrong, or they didn't understand why other practices of discrimination or slavery was wrong. So if you wait on people to get a conscience, then they'll never happen. And so I think that would be the concern that people would have about your desire to tell a story that is pretty much known, but people may not want to hear. So, yeah.
I think part of the problem is that not everybody knows that story. And in a democracy, unless you have the political will to take a very tough step, you're not going to be able to do it. I reached out to Brian Stevenson, someone who I really respect on this issue, and asked him, what's the best path forward? And he directed my attention to the memorial to those who have suffered under our system and in this country in Montgomery, Alabama. And he said, stories like these need to be told in every single community so that you form the consciousness and the will to be able to take the important steps necessary. Sheila Jackson Lee, former colleague of mine from Texas, has introduced legislation that would do this, that would begin this process of national healing by making sure that all of us understand our true national story. So I think those are the important first steps for us to take to make sure that we get to repair and reparation.
So as far as these conversations for reparations would look like, who would be involved in those conversations? Who would facilitate them?
Yeah, I think it's important that we have those conversations all over the country, community by community, as we've seen in places like Montgomery, Alabama. But I think there's an appropriate federal role. And again, Sheila Jackson Lee has proposed such a measure, House Bill 40, that would begin at the national level this conversation. To make sure that we understand how the wealth of this country was built, from whom it was kept. The reason that you have 10 times the wealth in white America than you do in black America, it is the legacy of slavery. It is Jim Crow, it is segregation, it is suppression, it is redlining, but it is practices that are taking place right now, today, in this country. Why do we lock up more people than any other place on the planet, and why are so many of them people of color? It is a legacy that has extended all the way since the end of Reconstruction, pressing African Americans into convict work gangs to continue to build the wealth of this country after slavery had ended. It was slavery in another form by another name. I don't know how many Americans know that. In fact, in my home state of Texas, in Fort Bend County, they just unearthed a graveyard of men and boys who were literally worked to death. We can see from the forensic evidence their muscles torn from their bones, working on sugar plantations, decades after slavery had ended, completely legalized in America. Another example of our criminal code being used to benefit some at the expense, literally, of the lives of others. I don't know how many people know that story. Until you know that, I don't know that you're moved to take the necessary steps to ensure that we have reparations and repair and justice in this country.
The issue, when you talk about political will, the point is that you know the story.
That's right.
You know the story. And the concern is if you wait for a consensus of people to come around to that point, what if they don't? And so why wouldn't you have the political will to act on cash reparations right now? Because as somebody who we are considering to elect as president, we are looking for you to have the will, not waiting for anyone else to join you.
Because I think starting at the end precludes us from being able to take the necessary steps to be able to achieve it. That conclusion, that policy action stops the conversation for so many millions of our fellow Americans. And again, in a democracy, you can be as right as rain on any given issue. If you've not been able to inform the consensus of this country, if you've not been able to break through to the consciousness of our fellow Americans as those civil rights marchers and freedom riders and activists and suffragettes throughout American history did to force those who were in power and held positions of public trust, members of Congress, the President of the United States, you would never get the necessary action. And so I think there's a really important role for the President to ensure that we have that conversation. And again, I'm taking my lead from those who have been working on this issue for much of their lives, who've been incredibly thoughtful about this.
You identify as a capitalist, but have also called out the economic system as being racist and unfair. So how can you have capitalism without racism and classism?
I don't know that capitalism and racism are inherently connected. I agree that our economy today is racist, but I disagree that it has to be that way.
Overwhelmingly, most experts who have studied capitalism would say that it has racist beginnings and that someone has to be at the top and someone has to be at the bottom, and that equality cannot be achieved through capitalism.
Well, I would argue that pick your form of economic organization, pick any dynamic of life in this country today, and it is racist. So whether it's the economy, whether it's healthcare, whether it's education, whether it's criminal justice, it is inherently, foundationally, and systematically racist. So when we're talking about the economy, how do we alleviate this? We make sure that in a capitalist economy, everybody has access to capital. So one of the proposals that I call for is doubling the size of community development finance institutions to get lending to small businesses in communities of color, to make sure that at least 50% of that goes to women in our economy so that we are creating wealth in every single part of America, to ensure that we stop discrimination. Right now in America, African American women earn 61 cents on the dollar that a white man makes for the same job, same value, same number of hours that they put in at the workplace.
Going directly to that point, what is your plan to address the gender pay gap, particularly as it pertains to Black women?
So we need to make sure that we vigorously enforce anti-discrimination policies in the workplace, but I think taking the next logical step and ratifying the Equal Rights Amendment, so enshrined in our Constitution, our foundational document and blueprint for how this country will be governed, it is absolutely clear that women will have equal standing in every part of American life, including the workplace. I also think it's really important that more women of color are elevated to positions of power. That means in elected office. That means in the boardroom. That means in any future administration. You see the full genius, and diversity and strength and power of this country represented. I think those are the steps we need to take to make sure that we address one of the most important challenges that we face.
Do you believe that people who are incarcerated should have the right to vote?
I would first focus on those who are locked out of our democracy based on the color of their skin, those who have not registered to vote through automatic and same-day voter registration. I'd make sure that Election Day is a national holiday, and I'd have a new Voting Rights Act to remove barriers that are put in place, whether it's voter ID laws or voter purges in Georgia, or those that were attempted in Texas, racist gerrymandering. And then, yes, I would look at the fact that we have the largest prison population. It is comprised so often of people who committed nonviolent drug crimes, who disproportionately are people of color, though all Americans use illegal drugs, deal illegal drugs at the same rate across race and ethnicity. And if this democracy is really going to reflect everybody, then we got to make sure that they're at the table as well. So I might begin by ensuring that the 4 million who have done their time, are no longer on probation or parole, are registered to vote and represented at the ballot box. And then I would look at those who have committed nonviolent crimes who are incarcerated today.
So you're for certain people who are incarcerated to vote, but not all of them?
You know, I think when you have used violence against somebody in this country, you have broken some basic trust and bond between us. And I think that gets at the heart of what makes a democracy possible, that non-violently you and I might be able to disagree, but ultimately see ourselves as Americans, see ourselves part of the same country, and see ourselves with a shared future.
The Central Park Five were
wrongfully
wrongfully convicted, but we didn't know that until years later. There's so many people who are convicted of violent crimes who did not do it, or they were overcharged. And so the whole system, according to many prison abolitionists and experts, is believed to be broken, which is why people are calling for that.
Yeah, I agree with the diagnosis that the system is broken for many of the reasons that we have described so far.
So the Central Park Five would not be able to vote under that logic that you're...
Yeah, well, if I were to use your logic, we might assume that everyone incarcerated is innocent or wrongfully incarcerated or convicted. I'm not willing to reach that conclusion. I am very ready to acknowledge that some are there under wrongful convictions, that we do have a racist system of justice. It's why I've called for significant criminal justice reforms to dramatically reduce the incarcerated population, to make sure that everyone who's served time is restored their full voting rights and ability to fully participate, not just in our democracy, but in our economy, to end the war on drugs. And this isn't a new position that I've arrived at. I wrote a book on this issue with Susie Bird 10 years ago. This is a longstanding belief and something that I think we should be able to act on.
As a senator and candidate, Kamala Harris has been outspoken about the black maternal mortality rate. How do you plan on addressing this issue if elected?
First of all, I'm grateful for Senator Harris's work on this, incredibly important. In Texas, during our race for the United States Senate, I talked about our very high maternal mortality rate, the fact that it's 3 times as deadly for women of color, and the fact that it's connected to the closing of more than 1/4 of our family planning clinics in the state of Texas. We made it hard for women not only to get a safe, legal abortion, we made it hard for them to go to a family planning clinic to get a cervical cancer screening, to get any kind of family planning help, or in a state that refused to expand Medicaid, any care whatsoever. So as president, I'll make this a priority. I'll make sure that we defend a woman's health rights and access to health care. I'm a proponent of guaranteed high-quality universal health care, and for pregnant women, especially pregnant women of color, making sure that we include more home health care visits, which have been proven to improve outcomes. And one other thing that I'd like to briefly add, we're also seeing a gross disparity in infant mortality in this country. In fact, the difference between white America and black America on this issue today is greater in 2019 than it was in 1850. So I think this is endemic of a healthcare system that has disparities in access, but also, even if you have access, disparity in treatment and outcomes. People of color are treated differently when they get care. So it cannot simply be a function of insurance and access. It has to be the training and the actual delivery of care and accountability for the quality of care that's delivered.
Your plan for protecting Roe v. Wade includes appointing judges who support a woman's right to choose and executive authority. I'm curious as to what your airtight plan is to ensure a woman's right to choose.
So in addition to that, let's make sure that our Department of Justice sides with women in every single courtroom across this country whenever their reproductive rights come under attack. Let's complement the 1973 decision with a statute from Congress to ensure that no state, whether it's Georgia or Texas, can exempt women from their full health care rights and their ability to make their own decisions about their own bodies. And then let's repeal the gag rule so that providers can make the best recommendations and referrals in the interests of the women that they serve. And then let's repeal the Hyde Amendment so that your wealth, your privilege, your luck is not a determining factor in your ability to get the health care that you need to be able to make your own decisions about your own body.
HBCUs around the country are struggling to stay afloat, with many of them struggling to stay open or closing outright. What's your plan to help to keep these institutions open?
So I want to make sure that we address the student loan debt crisis that we have in this country. It's $1.5 trillion right now. Guarantee that the first 2 years of college are free, that for low and middle income students, it's debt free, and not just tuition, but room, board, and books. But importantly, HBCUs need to be at the center of this. Very often their endowments are much smaller than other institutions. It means that tuition ends up being a lot higher, debt loads are much greater. There's a responsibility and a role for the federal government to increase funding to HBCUs because of the integral part that they play in economic success in this country. And as president, I will make sure that we do that, in addition to reducing the interest rates for those who have outstanding student loan debt, and then making sure that we expand the public service debt forgiveness program.
Now, you stated that you support free community college for students, but not free four-year college for students. Why do you support the two-year option as opposed to the four-year one?
I want to make sure that we're able to invest in everyone's success. So by guaranteeing 2 years free, by guaranteeing debt free for low and middle income students, by refinancing, by expanding the public service debt forgiveness program, and by making sure that if you do not choose to go to college, but instead want to go directly into a career, that we elevate the power of unions, your ability to join and apprenticeship. It means that we have the resources for everyone, and that we don't unintentionally favor wealthier families or those families who choose to go to college at the expense of others. So I want to make sure that we include everybody in this economy, and I feel that that plan to address higher education access, as well as career readiness and the ability to join an apprenticeship, is the best path forward. At a time of historic wealth and income inequality, the very wealthiest would receive no government subsidy to be able to send their children to a four-year university. I don't want to pay them to be able to do that. At a time of this record income inequality, those who want to improve themselves through higher education will receive a government subsidy, which may be the full cost of not just tuition, but room and board and books, or maybe some fraction thereof if they have the means to pay some part of their entry and stay at a four-year university.
You spent a lot of time with black folk in South Carolina. What are some of the most important issues they want you to address, and how would you address them if you're elected president?
The ability to fully participate in this economy, to be able to get a loan to start a small business, to be able to earn a living wage that you don't have to spend time at 2 or 3 jobs, to be able to afford to live close to where you work. Meeting people in South Carolina who take a 2-hour commute to get to their job because of the lack of inclusionary zoning and affordable housing in some parts of the state. People who ask me, as they did in Denmark at Voorhees, I want to be able to drink the water. But in this water system, as in many in South Carolina and Michigan and Texas and all over this country, the water is not safe enough to drink. And we know that race is one of the best predictors of whether the air that you breathe is toxic or the water that you drink is unsafe. So an environmental justice in this country is something that I hear about in South Carolina. Access to a world-class public school education. When we have such disparities, not just in access, but in how children are treated in the classroom. A 5-year-old child in kindergarten, 5 times as likely to be disciplined or suspended or expelled if he or she is a child of color. So not just investing in public school education, making sure that teachers are respected and paid a living wage, but that they actually look like the kids that they're instructing in those same classrooms. So all of these issues are important to the people that I've met in South Carolina, and I'm truly grateful for their willingness to guide me and to spend time with me and to inform this campaign so that we serve every single person in this country, especially those who in many ways have fundamentally been locked out of the success of this country.
During your run for U.S. Senate out of Texas, you got the Beyoncé endorsement. Are you seeking that endorsement now that you're running for president?
Look, I am super grateful that she supported me during the Senate race in Texas. You know, I understand that I would have to earn her support over the course of this campaign, just as I will have to earn the support of any American who's going to help to decide this election. So I'm going to continue to talk about the things that I think are most important, continue to listen to people about the issues that are most important to them, and make sure that this campaign really reflects the true ambitions and aspirations of this country and our willingness to ensure that this democracy allows us to fulfill them. And I hope at the end of the day that we've earned the endorsement of Beyoncé and really everyone who's going to help to make this incredibly important decision.
Thank you very much. This is a really productive interview. We appreciate you coming and giving us your time.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Gracias.